Inside Outer Limits is a regular feature on the Paranormal UK radio network. Again, and welcome to another edition of Inside Outer Limits radio show with my co-host Philip Mantle.
Yeah, good evening, Christopher. Nice to speak to you, mate.
You as well, mate. You as well. Glad to see that you're getting a little bit better now, and things are slowly moving forward for you, which is brilliant news. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to awakening at the weekend.
Well, yeah, I think it'll be a fun to attend. We'll meet a lot of old faces and a lot of new ones, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, that's the thing that I enjoy about conferences more than anything, is meeting up with old faces, as you call them, and, and making new friends and just talking with people. Sometimes the talks you have with individuals in the concourse are a lot more interesting than the talks that the person's doing on the stage. But I suppose that's
I wasn't
going to
say that, but there you go.
Well, I do, you see, though, Phil, so there you go. So, today we're interviewing a young man by the name of Paul Ascough. Ascaugh? I can't remember. Ascaugh, sorry, Paul, there you go.
No, it's a Yorkshire name, would you believe? And thank you for the young bit.
It is indeed, yeah. Paul Ascough, there you go, so brilliant. That's great to talk with you, Paul. For those that don't know Paul, he's had a long time interest in the UFO field, and he's actually an author who's just released his first book, I believe, Paul. Is that correct?
That's correct. I've been involved, dare I say, on the fringes of the UFO community. Fringe might be a wrong word to use in this connotation that it carries, but I've been interested. I've been a member of Bufora, was an investigator for a while, and sort of was an avid, what can I say, I won't say fan, but an avid researcher of the subject from, would you believe, being 11 years old.
Well, that's right. I understand that you had a sighting round about the age of 11. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I was, my brother and I, we lived on the edge of a village in the countryside, and from our front gate, looking out the front of our home, were just fields and fields and fields for miles. So we had really good views looking east. And our last job of the day as young children, I was 11, my brother was 9, was to take our dogs for a walk and the next door neighbour's dogs for a walk, who was quite severely disabled. He only had one lung, an ex-war veteran. So my father ruled with a rod of iron, as they did in those days. And and we went, took the dogs, came back. We used to say goodnight to our parents and go to bed. My father was sat in the bench under the front window in the garden, looking at his roses. And we sort of put everything away, went out to say goodnight. And as we say goodnight, it was sort of late evening, not quite dark. The first of the sort of good stars and the brighter constellations were visible. And my father, being interested in that sort of thing, was saying, what's that, which way's north? He always used to ask that. And to the north, from almost a direct line in front of us, was a big bank of cloud. And then looking northwards, the sky was cloudy. But to the south, the sky was completely clear. And as we're all looking up at the stars that were just coming out, I'm talking 1968. So it was long before a lot of light pollution, and we were well out in the countryside as well. These two UFOs, for want of a better term, came out of the cloud quite rapidly and then just stopped dead. Brilliant pearly white colour. You could actually see the light from them shining on the cloud, reflecting off the cloud. And they sort of came out the cloud, stopped dead. There was no deceleration. They immediately just stopped dead. And then after maybe 2 seconds, They sped off away from us, again going at a rapid rate of knots, no acceleration. They were either still or moving very quickly, and they moved straight out due east, down almost parallel with this bank of cloud. And as they did get close to the cloud, you could see this light from them shining on the cloud and reflecting off it. But also as they moved, you could see a very tiny sort of teardrop-shaped tail on them. And there were one stayed at one side and slightly behind the other. They stayed in the relative position. They didn't move relative to each other. No noise, no strobe lighting, no wings or anything else sticking out of it. It was just a brilliant sort of pearly white shape, a ball. Mm-hmm. And then they moved out completely silent throughout until they disappeared in the distance after probably another 30 seconds as they faded away.
Now, I understand from speaking with Phil, didn't you have a similar experience, Phil?
Well, for those that are unaware, Paul and I are old friends and colleagues. We'll probably go back, probably go back 25 years or more. And, you know, when I was active with Bufora in my various positions, Paul and I got to work together there. But Paul and I share a sighting, and I didn't know this at the time. I met Paul some years afterwards, but it was on the 23rd of July, 1984. Perhaps Paul will tell you what he saw first, and then I'll tell you what I observed that night.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Paul.
Right, I was actually living in Selby at the time, and we had a large dog that I used to take frequent walks, and it was getting early evening, just after our evening meal. Got the dog on the lead and went out in the back to take him out. Very large dog, a Pyrenean. And as I looked up at the sky, which I'm wont to do all the time, I could see what for all the world looked like two car headlights through fog. By that I mean they weren't, you couldn't see detail on them. They were just a white light, but they looked or appeared as you would see this sort of white, maybe a slightly creamy colour through the fog. And that's why I describe it as car headlights looking through the fog. And again, you couldn't see anything joining together. And they were this is in over Selby. I shouted to my wife. They were moving very slowly. Again, completely silent. No flashing lights, no anything. Just two white lights in the sky. My wife came out and looked at them. And then we shouted the two boys. The two boys came out to us, so there were four of us watching it. And literally it came over, not quite vertical, but over our heads, maybe 80 degrees, something like that. And literally, as we watched it, suddenly they accelerated away. Well, accelerator is the one word. They just were absolutely zooming off into the distance. And they moved in a westerly direction, and they just zoomed out of sight, and we just couldn't see them within seconds. So.
Excellent. So what was your experience with this?
Well, again, in July the 23rd, 1984, same evening, I was at work that evening. I used to work in a factory on the Howley Park trading estate in Morley. It's just literally along the road from the Asda supermarket in Morley. So I finished work about 5 to 10 in the evening. I lived at my parents' home in Tingley at that point. So you come out of the trading estate, you literally turn right, onto the main road, and it's one road all the way home. And as soon as I got onto the main road, it was a lovely summer's evening. It wasn't dark. I could see this light in the distance, and I knew it shouldn't be there. I knew the stars and the planets and the aircraft, and I thought, well, that's a bit, I don't know what that is. So I took off as fast as my little car would go. That was my first car. I had my Volkswagen Beetle, and
you didn't call it Herbie, did you?
I used to call it Wilma. Wilma car start in the morning. But so if anybody knows the area, there's a flyover that goes over the motorway. I belted over there, and as you come down the other side, there used to be a lay-by for the buses to pull in. So I pulled in there. I'm about halfway home now. It's just before the main Tingley roundabout, which is now much, much bigger than it used to be then. and I could see it was now 2 lights. So I lined them up with a lamppost, and they weren't moving. So I jumped back in the car, belted off back home to Tingley. Now, near where I lived, there's another bus lay-by, and you can see all of Leeds, city of Leeds in the valley, right out to Cookridge on the hillside opposite, and almost to the airport. To your sort of, just to your right a little bit was the suburb of Middleton on the hill. And these 2 lights, as Paul described them, were like pearly white. They were parallel with each other. The right-hand one was a bit larger than the other. You didn't have to cock your head back, Chris. I could watch these through my windscreen, you know. And they were just hung over Middleton. And totally, as far as I was concerned, you're not moving. There was no noise. And then, boom, blink, gone, you know. Just like that.
Yeah. This is wasn't that night? Wasn't there a series
Well,
of sightings that
that's
night
it.
all around the
Yeah,
Yorkshire
well,
area?
I was part of the Yorkshire UFO Society at that point. Been with them just over 4 years. So I shot off round home, grabbed my camera and my binoculars. I actually phoned Mark Birdsall, who set up the group with Graham, and I shot off back out to the same vantage point and stood there for about an hour. Never saw anything else, but the phone had started to ring. And when I went back to work the next day, some of my colleagues that I worked with who went home similar routes to me, some even on the same route, driving home that night, said, "Phil, did you see them lights last night?" And, yeah. And, you know, we received certainly dozens of reports, Chris, probably even into 3 figures. So Mark Birdsall and I took it upon ourselves to investigate these sightings, and we got reports from all over. What happened, as far as we could detail, is whatever it was around for about a couple of hours. It seemed to come across from your neck of the woods, from the East Coast, beyond us, out past Leeds, out to where Paul was living, York, sort of Selby area, then seemed to turn around, for want of a better word, and head back towards the coast. I mean, there was even police officers on duty in Leeds that saw it that night. And did you not see it again the same night, Paul?
Yeah. Now, this was the latter part of my story. I'd taken the dog for quite a long walk, having more of my eyes on the sky than I was on what the dog was doing. Didn't see anything at all. And then literally, as I get back to the house and I'm closing the gate behind the dog and letting him off the lead, they appeared above me. And by appeared, I don't mean they weren't there, then they were there. It was just me that noticed exactly the same formation as Phil said. They were just like 2 bright lights, slightly apart, parallel with each other. And they were moving back in the opposite direction by this time. So to me, they were actually moving back out towards the East Coast.
Yeah, well, that would confirm what our findings suggested. Yeah. And we found these out long before I met Paul. I met Paul, early 1990s, Paul, somewhere around there. Yeah. And just during one of our chats, you know, Paul says, "Oh, I saw something," you know, and I thought, "Oh, hellfire, it's the same thing I saw," you know. Shouldn't have surprised me, really, because we knew a lot of people had seen it, and we knew there was a lot more that hadn't reported it. But the only difference is when Paul's observation, it's actually moving. What I think I saw was actually stationary. And of course, what Paul is kind of confirming what we concluded, that it did a sort of turn around. Not fast, Chris. This was over an hour and a half, 2 hour period. It was heading back from whence it had come. What it was, we've no idea. I mean, we literally, Mark Birdsall and myself, contacted everybody from the Coast Guard out on the East Coast, you know, inland, you know, to the airports. There used to be a heliport in Leeds at that point. So I think it's long since gone. I knew it wasn't a helicopter anyway, because believe it or not, down in the dip where I saw this, but much closer, there was a chap who built his own company, and he got banned from driving. So he just got a helicopter. I always found it amazing that you could be banned from driving. I think he'd had one too many, but you could still fly a helicopter. Yeah. So he used to fly his helicopter over us. So, you know, we were on the flight path to Leeds Bradford Airport. Quite, you know, I knew what the aircraft looked like. It was nothing like any of these, and it was much lower, you know. And of course, behind where I used to live, where when I used to start early mornings, we used to see the planet Venus rise. So it was in the totally opposite direction for any of that. Wrong time of year anyway. And like I said, it wasn't quite dark. It was a lovely summer's evening, and you could see these things as clear as day. And I have no idea. Mark and I tried everything. Graham came to a different conclusion. Graham Birdsall. Basically, what Graham did, he got out an old map, and he pinpointed where these sightings had been made. We got the information in. Now, in 1984, we were still in the middle of the miners' strike, and Graham thought it was a helicopter spying on the miners because he put these pins in an old map, and on some of them there was coal mines. Well, what Graham failed to realise, it was an old map, and those coal mines had long since gone. They didn't exist anymore. Like at Middleton, where I saw this thing, there was no coal mine, and there hadn't been one as long as I could remember. It was long since gone. And not only that, the way the miners' strike worked, the coal miners never made any secret of where they're going to be picketing, so there was no, and they certainly weren't there at night, because they wanted the publicity and the television cameras, and so Graham's theory kind of fell by the wayside. Plus, it would have been in those days, it would have been the police helicopter, and it was a scarce resource, so to speak. Not like you have today. And but we never found an explanation for it. I always thought there might have been one, but I could never quite figure it out. I could never find one. And of course, we speculated, and I'm sure Paul will have his comment on this, that it might have been Earth lights. Who knows? That was just speculation, but we never got to the bottom of it. What would you say if someone suggested it might have been Earth lights, Paul?
Right. I agree it could appear as Earth lights, except it appeared to be intelligently controlled. Now, I'm saying that because it kept a dead straight trajectory, never moved whatsoever. It was, on either side or wobbled about or anything. It was just dead straight, like it was properly driving on a course, if you like. And then it absolutely zoomed off like warp factor 10, like the Starship Enterprise. It whang and it was gone. But it was still along the same trajectory. And then when it came back in the total opposite direction, and it went over my head until it disappeared out of sight. Now, it didn't speed up or anything. Then it just kept a constant, slow, low speed. Where Earth lights, you could argue from reports that we've had and people have investigated, myself included, that there's no definitive track or path that they follow that is in a straight line. They do move about, they do, and they generally don't last for that long either.
Yeah, well, that's what I would say. Normally Earth lights have been known to be around for, minutes, shall we say, but whatever this was around for a couple of hours, and maybe even longer for all we know, but certainly a couple of hours. I would agree that it could appear to be intelligent controlled. If that's the case, then I would say that there's a conventional explanation for it, but I just don't know what it is. The reason I say that, Chris, is because in my experience, and as most people listening will be aware, I've been involved a long time. Some people will say too long. But usually when you get a sighting that's seen over a large geographical area and it's seen by a lot of people, it tends to have a conventional explanation, of one form or another. So using that, I would suggest that there is perhaps a conventional explanation to what we saw that night, but I couldn't honestly tell you hand on heart what it was or what it may be. We tried our damnedest to try and track something down that could account for it, and we never managed to do that. So I would leave. Me personally, I would just leave it open to conclusion. I have no idea.
Yeah.
You see, from
another unexplained.
Yeah, but from my point of view, can I just say that had Philip seen what we saw in Selby, where it was moving slowly and then moved extremely quickly, and then move slowly again in the opposite direction, like 180 degrees from the direction we first saw it, then he may also have said it did appear to be intelligently controlled. But
Yeah.
I'm not denying that. I totally agree with what you're saying, Paul. It could appear to be intelligently controlled, and the way I think, if that's the case, then I think there may well be an explanation for it. But we couldn't find one. I mean, I think because it was something that I was personally involved in, we tried that a little bit harder. And, for months on end, Mark and I would say, well, we've got another sighting in, we've got another, and it was all, from July the 23rd, because in those days, of course, there's no internet, there's no email. People either had to phone us or write to us. And it never ceased to amaze me, Chris, how they used to find us, because we weren't registered anywhere. You couldn't find us in the phone book, but find us they did, thankfully. So it would never surprise me again if we weren't chatting with somebody and they said, oh, look at me, I saw that night as well. It would never surprise me at all. But there you go.
Now, what I've just realised, Paul, with your description of your sighting when you were younger, I think, as you said, in 1968, you described it as teardrop shaped.
Yeah. Now,
that is similar to, I believe, Phil, with what Mr. Hickson and Mr. Barker saw when it came down near them in Pascagoula.
Yeah, it was kind of teardropped stroke rugby, football they call it, but American football, which is not it's not the same sort of shape of a rugby ball we'd use here. It's a bit fatter, shall we say? And what amazed them is that it was pretty long, but it wasn't that high. It was, they thought it was 80 to 100 feet long, but only about 8 or 10 feet high, and that kind of puzzled them. I mean, everything about this puzzled them. There was this bright light, of course, and then they call it a door, for want of another word, this opening. And this light came from this opening. And when you hear Calvin under hypnosis talking about this, just this fact that this door, because they're used to seeing a door open conventionally, you open the door or you swing it or you pull it back. This just appeared. And this even more intense light emanated out of this thing and pretty much almost blinded them. And it took them a while for their eyes to get, adjust. But yes, it was not a perfect football. In Calvin's book, there's a couple of drawings of what it looked like. And sort of a teardrop on end, if you like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Most peculiar.
Yeah, well.
So, Paul, you was going to say something, Paul. There, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say mine appeared only as a teardrop shape when they moved. That was the strange thing that one of the things that got my attention was when they were still for those few seconds, they were a perfect sphere, but when they moved, the tail end. I'm saying that because I'm assuming from our position that we were observing them from. You could see there was a tail shape at the back, and it was only small, but otherwise there was still that perfect sphere. It wasn't football, as in American football shaped.
Yeah. Now, Paul, we briefly touched on your book, which is called The Real Story, a few seconds ago when we first introduced you. And what is your book about? Do you want to give us an outline of what it contains?
Right. In a nutshell, what I've tried to do, because...
No, we don't, Paul. We don't want it in a nutshell.
Right,
we want at least 2 hours worth.
Right. Well, over my life, I've experienced different things, paranormal things, as well as seeing these UFOs. Occasionally on my own, and occasionally with groups of people, which is much better because then, if you're all seeing the same thing, then that gives you some corroborative evidence. But what I've tried to do is, over the years, reading, going to the Beaufort conferences, listening to people, going to other different conferences, talking to people like yourself and Philip, your opinion does change over years. And initially, when I saw the first 2 UFOs with my father and brother, we were all just sat there in silence thinking, oh my God. And my father's first words were, well, there's nothing that we've got that can do that. And from that moment on, for me, it was like, why aren't people reporting this? Because this is so strange. It was something else that I say was, if you get somebody, well, like Calvin will tell you, if you get something that sees something that close, it's obvious that it's alien. It's obvious that it's not man-made. And occasionally, has happened to me on 2 occasions, you get this sort of, I'm not going to say a telepathic link, but that's what it feels like. And when we first saw these first 2 UFOs, they came out and they stopped dead. And immediately I sort of felt a connection, was like, uh-oh, we didn't mean to be seen. We shouldn't be out of the cloud. Now, whether that was just psychological, I don't know. But as an 11-year-old, psychology didn't even come onto my radar at the time. But that was just an impression that I got. And in another case as well that I investigated later, people, I'm not going to say contactees, but people that see UFOs at closer quarters, I'm not saying as close as Calvin did, but at closer quarters, sometimes also get that telepathic connection, for want of a better phrase. Now, just to go on, I've sort of documented different paranormal experiences and UFO sightings throughout the book to bring it from my first sighting up to date, up to the present. And just literally a few weeks ago, my sister and 2 of her cousins were on holiday, which they do every year, in North Wales, and they saw some lights in the sky. And they'd been out for the day, they'd come back, they'd been playing cards, so they'd been up quite late. So then they'd all gone to bed. And when they'd gone to bed, they were in this country cottage, and that is one of the cousins went to close the curtains. She looked out, not in a northerly direction from where they were, and there were 4 lights in a row. And again, it's a bit of a cliche, creamy white in colour, just like a car headlight, perfectly round, no apparent flight services, no wings or anything like that, no red or green strobes, no sound, perfectly silent, just 4 lights. Now, she said, I looked at it, and she says, immediately I got the sensation that I shouldn't be looking at this. And she says, it made me afraid. She says, but it was like I was being told not to look. And she said, I'll just step back and close the curtains. And she says, afterwards, I was thinking how irrational that was, and it wasn't normal, and no, that shouldn't be right. So 2 minutes later, she got a cousin, the older cousin, and they went back to the window, opened the curtains, and there was just one single, very large bright light there. And she said it was quite large. She said if you could hold a normal-sized light bulb at arm's length, it was that big. It was 30, 40 degrees above the horizon, appeared to be stationary, and she said we watched that for a while, and then she said for some inexplicable reason, again, she said I got scared of it. And then they stepped back again and closed the curtains again. And she said it was weird, it was fascinating, she's never seen anything like it before, but she said it was like whoever they are, they didn't want us to see them. So
Interesting. So, in your description of your book, which you can get on Amazon for folks, you can find it on there. Paul's had it up on Amazon now for a number of months. You're describing your description, Paul, that you personally believe these experiences contribute to the making of the real
yeah,
story of why we are
yeah,
here and where we are
yeah.
going. Why are we here then, in your opinion, and where are we going?
Right. Again, it's slightly going off the beaten track of ufology. What I've tried to do, and no offence to Philip or any other investigators, because I think
Philip won't take offence.
no,
He might take a gate and a couple of
yeah,
side panels, but he won't take
yeah.
offence.
But there's with some fantastic minds out there, some brilliant people. They've done a lot of footwork and a lot of fantastic books, and we need these people to bring this out into the open. And I think the more that this is brought into the open and brought more into the public domain so that people are aware of it, or are aware of it, then the better for ufology. Because in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion, this has been covered up, as in Dr. Irena Scott's book, lies and misinformation for the last 70 years. And I think that's absolutely true. And because of the media, shall we say, debunking and tongue-in-cheek comedic coverage of ufology, and that's contributed to it. Now, going back to what we were talking about earlier, where I said these people have done a really good job, and Philip's no exception, is that people tend to just do either a single event, as in the Calvin Parker case, or maybe UFOs from a single country or things like that. So you tend to get small portions of the whole thing. Now, because of some of the paranormal events and friends that I've got that have done research in paranormal groups, and even people on the, dare I say, fringes like Paul Daverow that do Earth Lights and other, shall we say, related phenomena like that, I believe that if science was to look at it and fund the money properly, instead of wasting money on SETI and these other stupid programs, if they looked at the things properly, they would be able to look into the paranormal and UFOs, and they come, I won't say under the same umbrella, but along adjacent umbrellas, and they're all part of the bigger picture, if you like.
Hmm. That's interesting. What was it that Stanton Friedman called SETI? Can you remember, Phil? Something or other to investigate. I can't remember what he called it now, but he wasn't that impressed
Well, a
with
waste of
SETI
time,
at all, was he?
basically.
Total waste of time.
Yeah, I mean, I have a colleague in London who's a big, fan of the SETI. And I've had this argument with him. I said, it's just a complete waste of time and money. I can understand why scientists are attempting it, but as I pointed out, the next most intelligent creature on Earth is the dolphin, and the scientists are led to believe that it does have a rudimentary language, but we can't understand it. We've no idea what its clicks and beeps are talking about. We can teach it to jump up in the air and catch a fish, but we can't speak to it and ask it a question. So, we're beaming signals out into the cosmos, and we're looking to receive signals. Well, how are we expected to understand them, even if we receive them? That begs the question as far as I'm concerned. And of course, the cosmos is so big. I read some space science material recently, and the visible universe is 48 billion light years across, and it has 2 trillion galaxies, and in those 2 trillion galaxies is zillions of stars and planets. So it's an immense thing. I mean, you point your radio telescopes out into space, where would you start? I mean, it's not only that, when we talk about ET visiting the Earth, and I'm not ruling it out, you think, how would they find us in the first place? That's always bothered me, Chris, because we've only been sending out, radio signals at the speed of light for, 150 years or thereabout? And maybe in 100 years' time, they'll be gone. The world will be completely digital, so we'll no longer be a hot spot in space. So, cosmologically, we've not touched, not even scratched the surface. Those signals have gone nowhere. And if you think about it, when you see the film Contact and they receive this signal and then they've got it on the screen, well, what they do, they've sent back some of the first TV pictures from Earth, which was the Berlin Olympics and Adolf Hitler in, was it 1936 or 34, somewhere around there, and so, I don't know. And I said, like, if you were to invent interstellar travel tomorrow, where would you go? Literally, I'm talking Star Trek, space travel. Where would you go? Where would you point it? And I don't know. I mean, mankind, for whatever reason, gentlemen, has always had this curiosity gene, is what I've often referred to it as. We want to know what's around the next corner, over the next hill, beyond the next horizon. But would that mean there may well be countless intelligent species out there, but they might be quite happy where they are. They don't have not have that gene, and so it would have been nice to have put those kind of things into the Drake equation. Here's me, a daft lad from East Ardsley, telling an astronomer what to put in his equation. Now, there you go. You know,
Philip, to go on from that, that's one of the things that always amazes me, how people say, well, we didn't see it or whatever. And it's when you actually look at the electromagnetic spectrum and the visible light that you and I can actually see, it's less than 1/10 of 1%. So if you think now, as in SETI and some of these others, where they're starting to go through the ultraviolet and then down through the infrared, when you look at the whole of the electromagnetic spectrum, if you go up, we'll just say through from visible light that we normally see, there's ultraviolet, then X-rays, hard X-rays, and up to gamma rays are the shorter wavelengths and the higher frequencies. And then you move down through the infrared, microwaves, and the longer radio waves and the lower frequencies. In my opinion, and again, it's just my opinion, that we are so, what can I say? I won't say backward, but we are at a Neanderthal, if you like, spot in our learning curve. And I'm not saying not in a derogatory way, because look how far we've come on just in the last 100 years alone. But if you we've only been around, or the Earth's been around for 4.5 billion years. If you looked at that on as a clock face, the human race in modern times as Homo sapiens haven't even been here for a minute. It's down to seconds.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, so if you look at somebody who, or we'll just say another species or could even be Homo sapiens on another planet, that could have evolved in the bigger scheme of things 1 million years before us. So they're 1 million years further down the road than we are. Now you just look at that on how far we've come on in the last 100 years. Where the heck are we going to be in another 100 years or another 1,000 years? And they have already surpassed that. So this is the other thing.
That's interesting what you say there, Paul, because I don't know if it's only me, but I've noticed a few places now where it's cropped up that people are saying, yeah, I tend to believe UFOs are real, etc., etc. However, not convinced it's ET. Could it be us from the future? Could this be, And now I met a gentleman many years ago, well, in the 1990s, he's a Japanese American. He's called Professor Michio Kaku. He's a cosmologist.
Yeah.
And he was in the UK promoting his book, which is called Hyperspace. And I met him at his hotel he was staying at in Manchester, and I managed to grab an interview with him. And he had to really dumb it down for me. I mean, make no mistake about this.
It would have been me too, Philip.
Yeah, and he talked about other dimensions, and he talked about time travel. And he said, theoretically, Philip, time travel is plausible. But he said the only thing we lack at the moment is the power source in order to make time travel possible. He said, I'll give you an example of the kind of power we would need. It'd be something equivalent to our sun. Yeah. But he said it would, it would never. He thought, well, it would never surprise me if one day somebody went pop and appeared, and that would be his, however many great grandchildren in the future have popped back to say, hello, Pa, you were right. You know what I mean? And he also talked about different dimensions. And he told me this story where he had a Russian cosmologist staying with him, and they went to a casino, and he got $50, and he put it all on one number. So Professor Kaku said, don't you think that's a mistake? Don't you ought to keep back? He says, no, he says, because I know in one universe I'll actually win. Because he was talking about these multiple dimensions. So he said, I know in one dimension I'll actually win. So that kind of made him laugh. And he talked to me in using Star Trek terminology so I could understand. And it was absolutely fascinating. And of course, Britain's most famous case, for want of a better phrase, is what happened at Rendlesham in December 1980. And of course, one of the witnesses involved there, Jim Penniston, has said that the object he encountered that night, he was told that it was a it was us from the future. And when I say us, I mean mankind. So I don't know, Paul. Maybe, who knows, mate? Who knows? But it just fascinates me. It really does.
Yeah. Well, this is one of.
I've,
Sorry, Chris, go on.
No, it's okay, Paul. Go ahead.
One of the things that I have always said, and that always annoys me, is when you see these, you go on Sky Television and see these programs, UFO hunters and whatever, and they're interviewing these pilots. Now, Philip, there, you had a good experience when you went with a television program recently. Was it Captain Ray Boyer, the pilot from Air from the Channel Islands?
Yes.
And now, dead straight, level-headed guy, been flying for donkey's years, lot of experience, and he just said this was huge, this was not normal, and this didn't have any flight surfaces on. So this is one of my big bugbears, that these flight surfaces that don't exist because they don't fly. And it's the same going back to what your professor said, where people assume because something's we'll just say for argument's sake, 5 million light years away, that it takes 5 million light years to get here. Well, these are saying, no, it doesn't. It's like there's people now, and I'm not saying that your professor's one of them, but they're really sort of moving things along, and that thought, if you imagine every thought that you have, we can measure, they can put electrodes on your head and they can see your brainwaves moving. Now, they can't decipher it. They don't know what you're thinking. But because these, we'll just say for argument's sake, could be a million years in advance of us, they can read it. They can see it. And I've been, again, only my opinion, but I think it could be because they're so far advanced in us. They can pick these radio waves up and they can make that connection. And it's just standard thing to them. And it's exactly the same as you think something that is a reality somewhere, as he said, and it's being able to, refine that and understand it enough so that you can do something with it that they can obviously do and we obviously can't.
Absolutely. So, just going back to your book a little bit again, then, Paul. This, I do know that you had a period of time in the military.
Yes.
And how did that help you in your research of the phenomenon that we call UFOs?
Right. Well, apart from sightings that I had when I was in the military, a couple of which are actually documented in the book, one of the things that I did, I was a medic. I've always been medically based and trained all my life, and I was in the medical centre for the local colliery when I could see what was going to happen with the miners' strike. But already being a member of the Territorial Army, I asked to go into the regulars and off I went. So in some ways, I feel like I skipped the boat and abandoned people. But in other ways, for my personal life, it did me a lot of good. So I went in the infantry as a medic, and one of my postings was Berlin, where it was still the Cold War there. It was still isolated. You were still, at the behest of the Russians, really, who controlled the whole of the land around West Berlin itself. And it's sort of looking at it from their point of view, we were like interlopers into their space. And working as infantry soldiers, you have to have a knowledge of what you're looking at. So I was a member of a close observation platoon and reconnaissance platoon. And as part of that, you learn all about yes, like most soldiers, you learn about ballistics and weapons and firing them. But you learn this in a lot more depth. And being a medic as well, you learn a lot more depth of what these weapons can do and the effects and blast injuries and things like that the normal public don't get to know about. Plus, we also used to teach aircraft recognition. We had to be able to recognise whether they were friendly aircraft or whether they were enemy aircraft, for want of a better term. So during that Cold War, I was just, for want of a better way of putting it, in the right place at the right time, where we had to learn about foreign technology, we had to learn about foreign aircraft, and you had to be able to identify them. So as well as looking at normal field work and weather, cloud formations and phenomenon like that, so that you knew when to move and when to stay put, you also was able to identify anything that moved in the sky, as well as, to a certain extent, astronomy and other things like that. That was part of my little things that I enjoyed doing, and doing that little bit more.
Excellent. Um, so while you was completing your research for the real story, was there any one particular sighting or close encounter that stood out above the rest for you? And if so, why?
Yeah. As we've just touched on earlier, I met Philip in the early 90s. I think it was 92 the first time at when we went to the Library Theatre in Sheffield for one of the Bufora conferences. And that sort of opened my eyes, really. I mean, there was the usual Jenny Randalls, Andy Roberts, Dave Clark, all the gang, if you like. But it was good for me because, like you say, it's great to go to these places and meet people, talk to like-minded individuals. But it's also good to talk about different subjects and maybe get a different perspective on things, or put some little seed in there that you haven't thought about. Because you can't be narrow-minded in the field of ufology. You've got to go with the flow, and if things change, you have to change with it. And I think that in the times that we're in now, it's really good for people getting into ufology. There are more, shall we say, scientifically minded people that are taking an interest and are genuine and are trying to help the subject along.
Yeah. So what's your opinion then, Paul, of the documents that have been, well, sorry, not the documents, the New York Times front page article actually admitting from the American Department of Defense, or the Pentagon, that they have been investigating UFO cases, and they were continuing to do so up until at least, I believe it was 2012, 2013. What's your opinion of that?
My opinion is they've been investigating it since the Second World War, and they're still investigating it today. They're just admitting
So
to
in
part
other
of
words,
it.
then,
They're not telling us
yeah.
anything we didn't already
So,
know, really.
well, that's true, isn't it? But I mean, in so many words there, though, they've admitted that they've lied to the general public,
Oh, yeah, they
well, the
have
public of the
since
world,
day one,
really.
yeah.
You know.
Since the Second
Yeah.
World
So
War, they have lied to the general public because they were afraid that there were things in our skies that they had absolutely no control over. They'd got no defence against it, and they didn't know anything about it. And it was just like, we can't let the public know that. We've got to, So that's why it's been debunked and poo-pooed ever
yeah.
since.
Well, that's why they brought the ridicule factor
Yeah,
into it, isn't it? So make everybody look like some kind of circus freak, for investigating UFOs, flying saucers, UAPs, whatever you want to
yeah.
call them. So how would you respond then to anybody who says that studying UFOs or being involved in the field of ufology is a complete waste of time? How would you respond?
Absolutely not, no. Because there's something out there that's far more scientifically advanced than us that we don't know anything about, or very little about. And it's only through people like Philip especially, who's getting through Flying Disc Press and getting information out there, that people are being made aware of it. Because let's face it, there are people now, and I know I live in a nice little cul-de-sac, and there are people on this cul-de-sac that have never considered UFOs in their life. It doesn't come into their life, and yet they've been there throughout their life. It's just been put on a back burner, and unless they physically see a really good sighting, don't even occur to them. Won't even come under their radar.
Yeah, I think most people tend to have that well, they don't really have the thought in their head that I'm going to go out today and I'm going to see a UFO, because 9 times out of 10 we live in a society where we're born, we go to school for so many years, we have to work. Then when you get to like our age, 60s plus, then that's when your family become, not that your family aren't important, but you tend to spend more time with your family. So we seem to go through life on this cycle, which is a loop, which continues to go round and round and round, and we don't think a lot of the time of the possibility of a life elsewhere, or is this life
Yeah,
visiting us? We'll just carry on, sometimes with blinkers on, seeing what's going
yeah.
on. Now, what is the future for yourself then, Paul? Do you have any more books in mind,
Yeah.
or do you have,
Now, I've just said yes. I haven't started yet, but because what I did with the last book, I just took notes almost over different periods of my life to what had happened, and it gradually expanded so that I could put it in some format that flowed, if you like, that made it easy for people to read. So what
yeah,
I've tried to do is make it so that people can understand, as Philip said with the professor when he was talking to him, it's very easy to get bogged down in science. And although some people are obviously more intelligent than others and always will be, don't make it difficult for people. You've got to write in ways that people can just pick it up and read it and understand it. And if you don't do
yeah.
that, and I'm afraid there are ufologists and authors out there that tend to lose people because they, they go too far off the other end of the scale, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, don't keep it in layman's
Yeah,
terms, Yeah, make it understandable for people. Yeah, I'm sure, I know I've picked books up at times and started to read and put them down because the language that is used in the book is just too far above my education standard, to put it
yeah,
bluntly.
yeah. I'm with you.
So, So, in your opinion, then, how do we keep moving forward with UFO research? Because I know quite recently, myself, you, and Phil, we actually discussed a little bit about Bufora, and I mentioned I believe that we need some kind of national governing body, which maybe not to take over, but maybe some kind of governing body where information can be searched and we can refer to other people's reports. I think we need something like that. How do you
Yeah,
feel?
I agree. In some ways, it's an ideal because it's like any subject, any workplace, anything in the world where you go to, you're going to get some genuine people who genuinely want to do good things and move things forward. But it also attracts the kooks and the fringe, dare I say it, and you can't help
And
it.
the egomaniacs?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but it's in every walk of life that we come across, and the field of
Mm.
ufology is no different. And I think the best way forward is to do what we're doing now, is to get it out. And I mean, modern science and modern technology and social media are fantastic for ufology because people can do more and more things. I know it's open to, what can I say, CGI on YouTube and things like that. But having said that, there are genuine cases out there. It's like I have a Facebook page which I use called It's the Real Story, and it's specifically for UFOs, UFO stories, experiences, and things like that. And I put a post on about now let me try and, if I can phrase it correctly, the China sighting, which was the Shaoshan airport in Hangzhou province.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was a really good, what can I say, genuine sighting. They closed the airport for an hour. It was seen by pilots. It was seen by lots of individuals on the ground with lots of photographs and with lots of video. And, apart from that, you've corroborative evidence from eyewitnesses on the ground. But you've still got some where somebody did a photograph, time-lapse photograph of a police helicopter, and then put that on and said it's just a hoax. And that sort
Yeah.
of, for shall we say, an outsider or somebody new to ufology, straight away that puts doubt in their minds. And it was the
Yeah.
same with the UFO over the Dome of the Rock of Jerusalem in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
Again, fantastic sightings. There's now 6 videos come to light, one of which, again, was done as a hoax. It was done on CGI to discredit all the others.
Yeah.
And people, I mean, like Jim Mousson, he went out there and interviewed a lot of people. And the thing that I've always said all along, it's not just having a photograph, it's no good just having a video. You've got to have corroborative evidence, whether it's on radar, whether it's other people, other witnesses from different locations. And the more information and the more corroborative evidence you've got, then the more it's going to stand up in a court of law, for want of a better term.
Yeah. What's your opinion of that then, Phil? Do you think we need some kind of new, modern storage system or some kind of maybe a place online, a website online where people can send information in and we can put it all
I
out and
think you're,
but with proper guidelines and
yeah,
run
well,
correctly.
Bube 4 is still going up, although pretty much in name only. There's still a handful of people, dedicated to it, and fair play to them. I mean, when I was director of investigations for Bube 4, we had 1,000 members, and out of those 1,000 members, we'd 10% volunteers of UFO investigators, and I had them all listed in different areas. We used to have regional coordinators, and one of the things I used to do, I used to go around all the other sort of local UFO groups and trying to build up a rapport with them, and well, we did okay in that. It's just that it's very difficult and it's very time consuming to set up and run such an organization. So I would never rule it out. What I would like to see, and this is one thing that would need some financial investment, is in Sweden we have the archives for UFO research. I mean, Klaas Vaan and his colleagues have done an amazing job in rescuing tens of thousands of documents, books, booklets, I mean, you name it, and they have got probably the biggest archive of UFO material anywhere in the world.
Isn't this the archive that Isaac Coy sends information to?
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
Well?
And
right, okay.
But it's in a place called Norrköping in Sweden. I mean, I've said to Klaas in a friendly way, the only thing wrong with it is its location, and so now I'd love to see that kind of thing here in the UK. I know. For example, there's one or two places in America that have smaller archives, like the museum in Roswell. But if you take our friend and colleague John Hanson, John has probably got the biggest collection of UFO material anywhere in the UK, a lot of which John has rescued. Otherwise, it would have ended in a skip somewhere. I've got my own small little archive here, but it would be nice if we could have a reference library or a university that would take this material, would look after it, make it publicly available, either in person or via the internet, Chris, scan it all in, basically. So it will be a proper, working reference library on UFO material from Britain. But it would need funding. That's the only thing, because, the more people of our age, as we shuffle off this mortal coil, what's going to happen to the stuff that I've collected? I've got a room full of it here. I have two daughters. They're not interested. And my wife's certainly not interested. And if you get somebody like John's rescued this huge amount of material, and full credit to him. But what's going to happen to it all when John's no longer with us? It's not a nice thought, but it's a fact of life. Well, the one thing we can all be certain of is when we're born is we're all going to die. So
absolutely. And in the middle you get married and taxes.
Well, yeah. So it would be nice, of course, if this would be with a thing like, I just take for example, I don't mean this literally, like the British Library, for example, and they would archive it, make it accessible, treat it seriously, in other words, because there are one or two sort of local libraries, I believe, that have got donations from a couple of guys when they've died, but they're just sat in boxes. They're not available to anyone. They're not accessible. And of course, over the last 10 years, I don't know how many libraries have closed. So it would have to be an establishment that's not reliant on private funding, that it's going to still be around in 100 years. So I think more than a UFO organization for UFO investigation, I think an archive is even more important. As we move further and further into the digital age, Chris, this kind of stuff may well fall by the wayside. But if it's handled correctly, it can be made available to anybody anywhere in the world. And I think it'd be nice if we got a Richard Branson or somebody like that was prepared to fund it. Although it wouldn't take zillions, but it would take some funding. So you never know. You never know.
Absolutely. Now, Paul, without embarrassing my co-host, we'll rule him out of the equation for this. Over your years' involvement with ufology, especially in Britain, let's not talk about the rest of the world for this moment. Which particular ufologists stand out for you as a personal example?
Right. Well, obviously, everybody has good traits and bad traits, and Philip's no
Yeah.
exception. But
well, he's got plenty of bad traits, let me tell you.
but the good outweigh the bad, so that's all right. And he's a
That's
Yorkshireman.
true.
But I mean, that was one thing with Bufora. I've been an investigator for them. Was able to meet people, going to the conferences, and I was very fortunate again helping them out, organising speakers at a conference. I was able to sit and have lunch with Bud Hopkins. What a lovely, lovely man he was. Fabulous guy.
Yeah.
Genuine, and he was one of again that was sceptical to start with. He was just an artist and did hypnotic regression to help people with different, shall we say, ailments, and just came across this. And after he'd come across it a few times, he thought, I think there's something more to this. And eventually he became swayed to the cause, if you like, and carried the flag for ufology over in the States. But I mean, going back to an earlier question you asked, there are people as well that sometimes you wish you could do more for. Like, I investigated a case with Philip's help to start with. Philip will remember, in a little remote area in West Yorkshire, and it was an alleged abduction. And you want to be able to help these people more than you can, because, as you can imagine, with an abduction case, unlike Calvin Parker years later, who's made his peace with things and got over it, and this was a young couple with two small boys, and the wife was genuinely terrified. And I wanted to be able to give her something more than, what can you say? Yes, you've been abducted by a little green men and they're going to come back and do it again, which was the general accepted thing at the time. And it was like, oh, no, that's the last thing she wants to hear, you know. So,
yeah, absolutely.
There are lovely people in the world of ufology, and there are some that aren't as well. But as I said earlier, this on the subject, unfortunately, like everywhere else, brings people in from all walks of life.
Yeah. I mean, I'll make no bones about it. The guy who's probably influenced me the most is rarely mentioned now, a chap called Hilary Evans.
Yep.
Right. Hilary and his wife opened and ran the Mary Evans Picture Library, amongst other things. Hilary was an author on all things sort of 14, really, not just UFOs. And I just thought he was a tremendous gentleman and an influencer, mate. But sadly, he's long since gone. He was a big supporter of UFO research. Wasn't that au fait with the abduction side of things, but it was still in those days gaining momentum. And like Paul has just said, I feel fortunate to have met most of these people, including Bud. Bud's voice has actually been in my ears today. Literally, I've been transcribing a hypnosis session with Bud Hopkins and the late Charles Hickson. And I literally finished that today. So I've had, it's funny you should mention Bud. I've literally had his voice in my ears today. But others that influenced me personally were people like Jacques Vallée, Graham Birdsall, who were totally opposed in their opinions and their directions, and I remember, Bud's coming to stay with me and talking to him about. I met him at various places around the world, and he did assist me with a couple of things that I worked on. So, I think all these people have an influence on you, whether you recognise it or not. And of course, Jenny Randalls was an influence in the early days, and a great many others that I could go on forever and mention them, but. One of the things I'd like to ask Paul is that he mentions UFOs and the paranormal. Now, there are still, even today, those that would say that these two things are totally separate. And that they should not be mixed in together. One of those who followed that path was Bud Hopkins. Bud called it stupid thinking, for example. So what's your opinion on that, Paul? Because you've mentioned that in your book there's UFOs and the paranormal.
Yeah. Well, it's not something I went looking for. It just happened. But anyway, just to touch on the other thing, but it covers both. When I was a teenager, I had an uncle who was in a Nottinghamshire UFO group. And he came and asked my parents, I'm going down to a meeting down in Warminster. Can I take Paul with me for the weekend? And thank God they said yes. So I just got in this old Reliant Regal van, God help me, went from one end of the country to the other overnight, and was in time to meet this group of people with Arthur Shuttlewood in Warminster, where we went to Clay Hill one night looking for UFOs, and then we went to Cradle Hill on the second night, and we saw some unexplained lights on both nights. But one of the things that Arthur Shuttlewood said to me, we were just sat, or rather stood, talking on the top of Cradle Hill, and we stood there, and he says, do you know, he says, I was once at Stonehenge, because my uncle and I had just been to Stonehenge during the day, nothing happening. So he says, we'll go. And in those days, you could walk right up to the stones and touch them. And I'd just been telling Arthur. And he said, I went down there not long ago. And he says, we'd seen something in the sky, a blue light. He says, and I walked away from the stones and out towards the heel stone. He says, and I walked towards the heel stone. And he says, and I'd got it in my back. He says, so I was leaning on it, looking back towards the henge. And he says, and as I put my head back on the stone, he said, I got this beautiful musical note that seemed to be coming from the heel stone and going up through me and up into the sky. And he said there was a lot more to, dare I say, these frequencies. He called them vibrations. And one of the things that, would you believe, a spiritualist, now Malcolm Robinson would be on this one, a spiritualist medium said to me, now, this guy I didn't know, I was just walking along, and he stood outside this building, which was the local spiritualist church. Not as a teenage young man I was interested in the slightest, but as I walked past, he shouted me and called me over by name, and he says, Paul, have you got a minute? And it was like, how does he know me? And I went over to him, and he says, I've been told to show you something. I thought, oh, yes, I've heard about people like this. Anyway, he gets a piece of scrap of paper out of his pocket, and he writes something on it, and then he shows me, and he'd just written UFO, and he says, I've just been told by Spirit to say that you're thinking along the right lines, and that was it. And it was like, eh? This guy I've never met before in my life, and he's telling me this. I mean, as a teenager, I was an avid reader. I read all. That's one of the other things, as Philip said, Jenny Randall. I think I read every book that she ever published. Jacques Vallée, there was Leonard Stringfield, Donald Kehoe, all the old writers, and I must have read every book twice. And it was those that sort of influenced you. And I think as part of Passport to Magonia by Vallée and some of these others, and then talking to Arthur, and then the spiritual connection with this other guy, and it was like, there's a lot more to this than it's not just the nuts and bolts and the physics of it. It's a lot deeper, and there's a lot more to it than we've been led to believe,
I mean, I met old Arthur Shuttlewood up on Cradle Hill. I was there with a friend of mine. We had no idea what we were doing. We just managed to find him, and I don't know. It was dark, and I couldn't tell you what time it was. And this old boy come wandering along, and I can't remember what he said now. And off he went. We'd no idea who it was. It was only some time later that I saw a picture of Arthur. I think it was in one of his books. And I said to my pal, that's that old boy we met up on Cradle Hill that night. And it was. I corresponded with him after that down the years, but that was the only time. He didn't say I'm Arthur Shuttlewood. He just said, I think he asked if we'd seen anything, because it was pretty obvious what we were doing. Stood in the middle of nowhere with a pair of binoculars in the dark, you know what I mean? But I turn this around on you, Chris, who was sort of your influence in ufology when you first became interested?
Well, I first became interested in the early 70s, around about 1974. I know we've discussed my experience before, Phil, with the strange
Yep.
lights moving across the sky. But just slightly before that, the person that influenced me was somebody who will not be known. His name was Jeffrey McCann. He was actually my uncle, and he had a load of books, and I was staying at his house, and I was reading some of the books, ghost stories, and real life ghost stories, etc., etc. But once I had my experience with this unusual light, again, probably like yourself and like Paul, Major Donald Kehoe.
Yeah.
I read plenty of other books he brought out. Arthur Shuttlewood, read many of his books about the Warminster thing. People like Desmond Leslie, and read his books as well. And coming forward, up to, shall we say, the modern era, people like I forgot his name now. Philip Mantle, yeah, that's him. People like Philip Mantle. I'm not going to mention him, but there you go. People like Philip Mantle and the work he's done. Paul Sinclair. There are many. In John Hanson as well, who's already been mentioned. I haven't actually read any of John's books, but when we had him to speak at the conference a couple of years ago, when he was given the first Outlets Magazine award, I had a chat with him then, and some of the things he was telling me were fascinating, absolutely mind-blowing bits of information that he contains in that head of his. Where does he store it all? So it's people like that, and people who I've looked at both sides of the argument, the ETHs and the non-ETHs and so on, and I'm still kind of like stuck in the middle of that, and I'm looking for answers. Again, which is why I bring out Outer Limits magazine itself, because giving people both sides of the argument equal scope to publish the thought.
Well, I'm like Paul.
So those are the people that influence me.
My opinions, are forever changing. Just think you're on you're straight and narrow. You think I've clicked it here, I've got it here, and then something will happen, or you'll read something, and then it throws you into a spin again. But I was also influenced by old Eric von Daniken and his book Chariots of the Gods.
Oh yeah.
Now, I remember reading it, and I was fascinated by it, and I was fortunate to meet him many years later at a conference I was speaking at in Vienna, and we had a dinner together. Not just me and him, all the speakers, and I had a chat with him then. But I know, if you look back at Chariots of the Gods, probably a lot of the artifacts that he mentions all now have an earthly explanation. But I think what the book did was to say, question things. Don't accept everything you're told. And that always remained with me. And I think that's the overriding sort of theme of the book, is to question things. And it's like Paul was talking about, was where we are with ufology today. Personally, and I've said this on several occasions, as a UFO researcher stroke investigator, I look upon part of the role as being someone who will document the evidence and preserve it for posterity in the hope that somebody at some point will be able to make sense of it and will come to a definitive conclusion. I know there are people who are thinking you're talking nonsense. This is just modern folklore. And in 100 years' time, 150 years' time, people will look back on ufology and with a smile, as we today look back on sightings of fairies 150, 200 years ago. And we now consider that folklore. Whereas, for example, my mum, God bless her, she's no longer with us, but she came from rural Northern Ireland when she was young, and she told me when she was a child, she met a fairy by the stream on the farm they lived at, and it was real, physical, pretty clothes and wings, and she had a conversation with it, and she not only told me that, she told my children that story, and I asked her many times, was it real, Mum? Did it? She says it was real to me, son, and that was it. But we now look upon reports as that as preposterous. It was mythology and folklore. So
I think. Sorry,
so will that happen to us?
It's a good possibility, isn't it? Really?
I've heard somebody quote, I think it might have even been Andy Roberts, God bless him,
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Andy is a well-known skeptic, but he's not a bad fella at the end of the day. Me and Andy have been friends for many years, and Dr. Clark, and I knew Dr. Clark long before he was a doctor, but what they've said, and
It was just a
it was
Clark, was
just a
he?
Clark. I'll tell you a little story about him in a minute, but you know, let's say 150 years from now, obviously us three won't be here, but will the scholars of the day be looking back at your magazine, Chris, at Paul's book, or any of my books, and class that as folklore and mythology?
Quite possibly,
Well,
quite possibly. I'll just, before you tell us the story about
yeah,
Dr. Clark, what I wanted to do is, I didn't mention Eric von Daniken, even though I did read many of his publications back in the 70s. Now, the reason I didn't mention him is because there's a lot of controversy now surrounding him, and you know, a lot of people are suggesting that he stole ideas for his Chariot of the Gods from the French author Robert, is it
yes,
Charroux? You know, and a 2004 article, I think it was, in Skeptic magazine, stated that he plagiarised many of the ideas from The Morning of the Magicians, you know, another book. And I do also know that there were other books written in German that I believe he also got some of his ideas from. Nothing wrong with that, because we all share ideas anyway. But one of the things that I did find interesting was one of the artifacts that he offered himself in one of his books has actually been disclaimed by von Daniken himself. You know, it's supposedly a rust-free
in
iron pillar
India,
in
yeah,
Yeah,
India,
yeah.
yeah, which was evidence of extraterrestrial influence. But Daniken, he admitted in a Playboy interview, in all the magazines to go into, that it was a man-made pillar, and that as far as supporting his theories goes, we can forget about this iron thing.
yeah.
So it kind of made me think. But then again, you know, there's nothing wrong with people changing their minds, as you know, Phil, I've done, and I know you
Absolutely.
have.
I mean, you know, what we have to remember about Eric is he wasn't the first to write or talk about ancient astronauts.
Yeah,
Similarly, you know, Alan Hynek is classed as sort of the father of modern ufology, but he certainly wasn't the first. I'm not
no,
suggesting Hynek plagiarized anything or anything like that, but you know, with von Daniken, he certainly wasn't the first. But he is classed as the father, rightfully, of you know, the ancient astronaut theory because of his
yeah,
popularity. And
yeah,
like I said, you know, I think all of his, I think in Chariots of the Gods is the iron pillar that you're talking about. All of the
yeah,
artifacts in there have an earthly explanation, but I think, like I said, the book to me wasn't necessarily about the individual artifacts. It was just teaching you to question things. And
yeah,
as a theory, because that's what it is, it's a hypothesis, a theory, call it what you will. The ancient astronaut theory is still the same today as it's ever been. It's not been proven, and but it's just an interesting theory. And if we're honest, it's rather nice, isn't it? It's a rather nice way of looking at puzzles, because you know the last place I ever visited overseas was Egypt in 2010, and with my wife and my daughter, and I don't believe for a moment that the pyramids and the Sphinx were built by aliens, but we had a guide, and I told him that, and nobody had ever said that to him. He look, you know, so I pulled his leg a bit about that. But you know, I think we underestimate our ancient ancestors in their abilities, shall we say, and. But it's just a nice theory. And it's one you could never prove in 1,000 years, no matter what, you know, because we are all stardust. There's nothing on this earth that can't be found elsewhere, you know. So, but yeah, but I met, like I say, I met Eric von Daniken at a conference I lectured at in Vienna, in Austria, many years back. And he was just a nice guy. Yeah, you know, that's all I can say about him. He was the sort of opening speaker, and then off he went. But we had dinner the night before, and I think he's had a big influence on a lot of people. To be
yeah.
honest,
I've got to say, he certainly came over last. I was at Awakening last year, and he spoke there, and it certainly came over as a very, very nice gentleman, you know. And what I've said isn't being critical of him. It just made me think slightly different of him, you know, and some of the things that he'd put forward. But yeah, you're right, Phil. I think it was teaching me to look at things a little bit deeper. But even so, very, very interesting pieces that he put in his books, his many books.
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to Dr. Clark, shall we? Now,
Yes, please
because
do.
one of the things that's haunted me from the day I've got involved with it is the infamous alien autopsy film hoax. Now, about just over a month ago, an 11-page memo was leaked. And the memo is written by a chap called Eric Davis. Various people are copied in on this memo. It's a series of sort of emails that have been put together. Hal Puthoff is one, Colm Kelleher, and it's basically a summary of claims made by Dr. Christopher Kit Green. Kit Green did work for the CIA on their, what we would call their weird desk. Well, that was only a small part of his work, I've since found out. And he's an MD, PhD. I think he still runs a medical practice in the United States. Now, in this 11-page memo, even yours truly it gets a brief mention. But there's a couple of things. Dr. Green says that in 1987/88, at the Pentagon, he was briefed and he was shown a file on an alien autopsy. And that the creature in that file was exactly the same as you see in the film released in 1995 by Ray Santilli. So they're 7 or 8 years apart. But he can't have seen the same thing because it wasn't conceived and designed and made until 1995. So I think he's since gone on to say what the CIA must have lied to him, but that doesn't actually explain that. But then later on in this same memo, he then gives his own medical opinion of what he sees in the Santilli alien autopsy film. So he gives a medical opinion of it, and he's and he's talking about the heart and the brain. Well, as we all know, it's a fake. It was actually made by Spiros Malaris and a small team that worked under him. The brain, for example, in the creature is 2 sheep's brains put in strawberry jelly, and the various organs that come out are offal from the butchers. So I'd like to know why, a guy who worked at the CIA still runs a medical practice and as an MD and a PhD couldn't recognize that, these were giblets, basically, So Richard Dolan from the US has been in touch with him and has got an interview with him that first he said he was going to release, now he can't, so he's going to write it up as an article. So, we'll see. But where Dr. David Clark comes in, David's a long-time UFO investigator. People forget this. David was investigating UFOs when he was a teenager. And I mean investigating. I mean going out, knocking on doors, talking to people. A long history in folklore. And so David had a degree in archaeology. He then became a journalist, took a journalist course, and he worked on the Sheffield Star. He's from Sheffield. He eventually went on to take his PhD in folklore, and he teaches journalism, lectures on journalism at the university in Sheffield. But David is a well-known skeptic, certainly about the extraterrestrial hypotheses, pretty much UFOs in general. But he's a nice skeptic, if you know what I mean. But I find it kind of ironic that back in 1995, when David was working at the Sheffield Star, he contacted me and he says, Philip, I'm doing an article about a local lad. He's starting as a UFO investigator. Now he says, I know you've got a conference coming up in Sheffield later this year. Give us a comment about that. And I'll do a larger article somewhat nearer the time. So I mentioned to him all the speakers. I mean, at that conference, people forget, this is the one that we eventually showed the alien autopsy film in public for the first time. But we got 2 Russian scientists on the bill and various other people from around the world, and I just gave an off-the-cuff, alien autopsy. So David printed it. I've never seen it. And then a few days after it went out in the Sheffield Star, I was contacted by a company called White's Press Agency. And all they were interested in was the alien autopsy. My quote I'd given to David. So all I could tell them was what Ray Santilli had been quoting to me. And I told them the story of what he alleged. I never thought nothing about it. The next day, things went absolutely bananas. They'd put this out on the wire service. I was getting faxes from Australia and all 4 corners of the globe. It went bananas. And I passed most of them on to Ray Santilli. They couldn't find Ray because it just said London businessman Ray Santilli. It didn't tell no name of his business. But Philip Mantle and Batley could find me in the phone book, So, the phone never stopped. So at that point in time, this was probably, I don't know, late April, 1995, somewhere around there. Santilli had only planned to release the film on video, his own little video that he'd made, his own little documentary, which I worked on for him. But because of all the publicity that it received, that's when the television became involved. So I find it kind of ironic that Dr. David Clarke, as he is now, a very sceptical UFO researcher, was responsible for letting the cat out of the bag and publicising for the first
we can blame David Clarke,
the alien autopsy film. So the alien autopsy film took on a life of its own, Chris. It really did. It snowballed.
Oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
nobody, especially Ray Santilli, had any idea what was going to happen. And in the end, Ray had to hire a guy called Chris Carey. Chris was apparently well known in the film and television industry, well respected. And Chris went and negotiated a lot of the contracts. And he's the only one out of those that were involved in it right from the beginning that I've never managed to get an interview with. I met him many times, don't get me wrong. So I have no idea if he ever knew that the film was a fake or not. I suspect he does, but it's only a suspicion. I don't know for certain. And I tracked him down a few years back when he was working at a company in London, and they actually made, the 3D cameras to do the 3D movies. He worked at a company selling those, and I left messages for him, and I wrote it, but I didn't get a reply, so I just left it at that. I wasn't gonna hound the man if he didn't want to speak, but I'd love to get an interview with him. I would love to just to ask him, did you know, or at what point did you know that the film was a fake, and just to see what he had to say. So.
Yeah, it would be interesting to get on the record, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So, like I said, we're coming full circle, and now we have these leaked documents. It's looking like they may be authentic. I don't know for 100% certain. There's one of the gentlemen named in the documents. I won't say his name in public, but I contacted him, and that's basically what I asked him was, are these authentic? And he said, off the record, they are. So I've no reason to doubt him. He seemed, but he went on to say we've reversed our comments since then. So. They no longer believe the alien autopsy film was real. I got the impression they were kind of embarrassed that this leak had occurred, Yeah. And of course, like I said, I'm mentioning them very briefly. And it's caused, a furore yet again. I've heard Gary Shoefield, which is Ray Santilli's business partner. He lives in America. I've heard him being interviewed. Talk the biggest load of tripe I've ever heard. I've heard Ray Santilli go on again, even more tripe. For those that don't know what I'm talking about, tripe is another word of saying rubbish. I don't. Did they say tripe anywhere outside of Yorkshire? Did they use that phrase? I don't know.
I wouldn't know, Phil. Tripe is actually it's the lining of a cow's stomach, isn't it?
It is, but we call rubbish tripe. I don't know if you use it anywhere else. But I've again raised his head. I've heard on the grapevine that they were trying to get another documentary made. Well, good luck to them. It'll be the same old tosh. people are thinking they're reinventing the wheel, that Ray's going to give them a bit of film to analyse. Well, dream on. It's not going to happen because there's no film
No.
exists,
I think it's quite appropriate, Phil, that you're calling it tripe, because to me it's just Ray Santilli jumping on the cash cow again. So,
Yeah.
I think it's quite appropriate that you're doing that.
Well, yeah,
Really.
I mean, I know Ray. I know his business partner, Gary Shoefield. I know exactly what they're like. And I said to these gentlemen that were interviewing him, and I said, with no disrespect, you're the wrong people to interview him, and you're asking the wrong questions. And the reason that is because you know nothing about what you're talking about.
Mhm.
And I said, I guarantee you, if you'd have said that I was going to be on there with him, they wouldn't have agreed to the interview,
Mm.
So, and then of course, unfortunately, I watched Linda Moulton Howe talk for an hour and a half about how the alien autopsy is real because she once sat in Ray Santilli's office, apparently. Well,
It's
and I've
an hour
emailed.
and a half that you'll never get back in your life, Philip.
Well, I had to remove my shoelaces and my belts and all sharp objects. You know, like they do when you get arrested and put in the police cell. You know what I mean? And
Oh dear.
it's a shame. I emailed Linda and I said, it's not real. Got no reply, of course. So what I did in my own little way to try and counter all this tripe was I wrote a book a few years back. It's called Roswell Alien Autopsy. It's all about it. It tells the story right from the beginning, right through to finding Spiros Malaris, or sadly, I should say Spiros coming forward to us, and telling the whole story in between. And I've offered it free of charge, and I've sent about 100 PDFs out, maybe more, and that will remain open. If anybody wants a PDF copy and know the facts, they can have it.
How can they contact you, Phil?
Just punch in Flying Disc Press, on Google, and it comes straight to me on Facebook or via, I've got a blog, Flying Disc Press blog, and there's contact details on there. No problem. And they can have a PDF copy, free of charge with the greatest of pleasure. I mean, you've got a hard copy, Chris.
Yes, I have, and I'm reading it at the moment. It's quite interesting, very, very well put together. And it's, in my opinion, there's no other person in a better position to explain the story of the world's most famous hoax. So, if you want to know what's going on, folks, and you want the truth, which is the important part of this, that five-lettered word, truth, then you really should be reading this publication from Philip, whether it's on PDF or a hard copy. You need to get your hands on it, because no punch is spared, basically. Have a read of it.
I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I was Bufora's conference organizer, press officer, and director of investigations. And in 1993, we had a letter from the Merlin Group, which was Ray Santilli's company, and it was his. And he asked Bufora about could we assist in a UFO documentary. So I wrote back, sent him some info. Letters went backward and forward. In fact, I've got some of my letters from him. I think I've got one fax still available from 1993 with Ray. And it was only later on he then went on to say, well, I've got film of Roswell. So show it. Let's have a look. Yes, I can. No, I can't. Yes, I can. No, I can't. I met him in London once. He told me this story about, meeting a military cameraman while he was out in the States looking for Elvis footage, and he bought this film off him. And so in the end, I told him to bugger off, Rick, basically. I said, I don't believe you. So in 1995, we were sent a video of Roswell, the movie, made by Paul Davids. It was just coming out. It was released by Sony, and they sent us a review copy. Again, it landed on my desk, and I thought, I wondered if that Santilli guy still claims to have Roswell footage. So I found his business card. I rang him up, and he said, "Yeah, you don't believe me, Philip." I said, "Well, I can't believe you until you show me the film." So he said, "Okay, make an appointment with my secretary. Come on down, I'll show you." So my wife and I, off we went. And to begin with, Ray's office was in Balcombe Street in London, just off the West End. And hey presto, he pops a video into the machine, and he showed us a piece of film called the tent footage. He claims this was the creature recovered on site in the desert, and they put it in a tent before they whipped it off to wherever. And there was a couple of doctors examining it and so on. And he even gave me a copy of it, Chris. You know, a video I've got, and I still have it here today. Over the next couple of months, he went on to show us 2 separate and different autopsies, one of which is the one everyone's seen on television or on YouTube or wherever. He then showed us some debris film. Now, when I saw the autopsy films, I asked Ray what his intentions were, and he said, I'm going to put it out on video. So you'll be able to buy it in your local video shop, you know, or Blockbuster or whatever that was at the time, or direct from him. So there was no television involved. And he asked me to work on it, and I did. He made his own little documentary. It's narrated by Brian Blessed. So if you hear it and you hear Brian Blessed chattering away, those are the words that I wrote. I lined up Kodak here in Hemel Hempstead to analyse his film, various other things that he never took any notice of, but that was, you know, the extent of my dealings as far as that was concerned. So I just said off the cuff when I first saw it, I just thought to myself, this needs to get out into the public. So I asked him, I said, would you show it at our conference later this year in Sheffield? It was all organised, conference was all done, and to my surprise, he said yes. And of course, a couple of months later, David Clark and me accidentally, you know, released it into the news media, and it just spread like wildfire. Yeah, wildfire.
And it grew like a massive disease.
It just took off.
Really.
You know,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
and I was accused of being Ray Santilli's accomplice. I was accused of making a load of money. Ray paid me a small fee to work on his documentary. That's where that came out. For example, I mean, Paul was around at this time. I was having an extension built on my house. And they said, where did Mantle get that money from? He don't have it. Well, they're right, I didn't. But my wife, Sue, did. She'd had her own property before that she'd sold, and we used some of the money for our extension. So it got kind of personal. So I remember sitting having lunch with Santilli one day, and I just said, Ray, I don't care how long it takes, I'll get to the bottom of this one day. And he just smiled and said, that's okay, Philip, and we just carried on, you know. And like I say, now it's come full circle, you know, leaked documents.
Yeah. Right, guys, what I want to do now, because we've only got about 18 minutes left. Paul,
Yes.
your book, The Real Story, where can we get it from?
You can buy it on Amazon, on paperback or on Kindle. And I'll also have hard copies with me at both the Awakening Conference and the House Limits Magazine Conference in Pontefract.
That's brilliant. Now, just before we go away from this, because I do want to talk to you about the Awakening Conference, you know, what we're looking forward to before we finish, I want to just quickly read a quote, because I do know that your book, Paul, just doesn't cover UFOs. You know, there's UFOs in there, ghosts, spiritualism, ley lines, poltergeists, you know, and even I think you've got life after death experiences in there as well. Just going to read a quote from a gentleman I've never met before, don't know him, but it's on your Amazon page for selling the book. Mark Martin gives it 5 stars out of 5. Brilliant, very well written exploration of the paranormal. And he's put, this is a very well written, intriguing and engrossing exploration of UFOs and the paranormal. Highly experienced investigator Paul Ascough uses his own experiences to take the reader on a journey of discovery. So if you're interested in taking that journey of discovery, folks, you really do need to get your hands on a copy of Paul's book. Now, as I mentioned a short time ago, myself, Philip and Paul will actually be having a stall at the Awakening Conference. Well, we'll be there at the Awakening Conference, and I just wanted to ask you both, who are you looking forward to listening speak?
Well, me personally is our old friend Paul Sinclair. I mean, I've seen Paul speak, I think, twice now, Chris, at your events, and I found him captivating. And Paul reminds me of, some good old time ufology. Paul, for those that don't know, Paul's up on the East Coast, not that far up the coast from you, but he likes the field work, does Paul, and they've had a lot of activity in that area. And I think the gentleman's done a marvellous job. He's just got his third book out, and I was going to order it online, and then I realised that Paul was a speaker at this event, so I'll go along and buy one while I'm there and get him to sign it. Even though I've been involved for 40 years, I still like to get a signed copy of people's books and add them to my collection. So, I'm looking forward to seeing Paul. He's top of my list, let's put it that way.
What about you, Paul?
Well, yeah. I mean, as Philip says, he's an excellent investigator, is Paul Sinclair. Does some really good work. And it's his subjects that he tackles also just touch on the paranormal as well. Some very odd experiences. So, I mean, I'm not saying I want to go and see Linda Moulton Howe or David Childress particularly. Mike Barrett, I don't know. There's some really good speakers there. So I think I'll just see what happens on the day and see when I'm busy, when I'm not. Interesting people and interesting views.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to catching Paul's talk. I understand that the talk he's doing at Awakening will be different to the talk he's doing at the Outer Limits magazine conference in Pontefract. So that's good. So we're going to get two.
You probably know better than me, Chris, that Paul's done so much research. He could give a different presentation every night of the week.
Oh, absolutely, and he could talk all night as well.
Like we said right at the beginning, one of the things I always look forward to at these events is meeting up with old friends we haven't seen for a few years, and people we've sort of known on social media or email, but we've never actually met or actually coming along. So, and I've said all along, come and say hello. I know, for example, Jason Gleaves is going to be there, and got a new book out from Flying Express. Just get a little plug in there. The ufology umbrella, literally just out. So Jason will be there, and I think he may be selling copies of his books. That's all down to me because I've ordered them and they haven't arrived yet. So,
right, okay.
There should be.
So it'll be your fault.
They should be arriving on Friday. But that's always the nice thing about these events, and it'll be the same at the Outer Limits conference in Pontefract, meeting old friends, meeting new ones, that have trekked halfway around the country to get there to see you. Yeah. So, that's top of my list.
Yeah, well, I do want to also, if possible, I do want to listen to Richard Dolan and see what he's got to say about this. Yeah, I just want to know what he's got to say about it, how he's going to dig himself out of a hole, basically. Because it's going to be interesting, the information he's going to give out, regarding, the Santilli footage, basically, and the alleged, yes, it was the same conversation, that Kit Green saw. So, let's see what he has to say.
And as you know, gentlemen, I collect this UFO stuff, both books and memorabilia. So I'm looking forward to buying some of that while I'm there as well. So, and we've got a stand, so come and buy some books from me and Paul, and sign up for Outer Limits magazine. Shall we not give that a plug, Chris?
Yeah.
Yes, let's give that a plug as well, yeah. Well, I'm also selling conference tickets for the Outer Limits magazine conference as well. 17th of August, Pontefract Town Hall. It's a Saturday. Doors open at 10 o'clock. First speaker's up at 10:30. And that's me, folks. So you're going to want to get there for 12 o'clock when I finish. So there you go.
Yeah. Just a little aside to what we were saying earlier, Chris, where you said you gave that quote off my book where somebody put 5 out of 5 stars on Amazon. The guy's a guy called Mark, and I've known him for quite a few years, and he was also a paranormal investigator. So I was quite pleased that he said, if you've written a book, Paul, I'll buy it. And then when he did that, I was quite humbled, really, that I thought, at least another investigator. Yeah, Mark did a lot of work on the Longdendale lights in North Derbyshire and things like that. Some very bizarre stories from over there.
is it Longdendale, the place where they occasionally see a World War II Lancaster bomber flying
Yeah, and
through?
it flies down into Lady Bower Reservoir because that's where
Yes,
the dam busters trained.
Yeah,
that's
Yeah,
correct, Phil.
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes. We live in a strange world,
yeah.
gentlemen. We really do.
Mm. Just
Right.
sorry, Chris.
Go
Just
ahead,
one
Paul.
thing I
Yeah,
was
okay.
going to
No, it's
say
okay.
was throughout my book, I've got several quotes at different ends and beginnings of chapters and places. And one of the things that I think is quite pertinent to the conversation we've just had was a quote from Buddha that says, "Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, and it doesn't matter if I have said it, and you don't believe it unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense."
Well, do you know what? I actually think that's a brilliant place to end the conversation. So, what I'm going to say is, Paul Ascough, thank you very, very much for joining us today on Inside Outer Limits radio show. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the weekend. And I'm sure Philip would like to say
Yeah,
something as well.
great. Thank you very much, Paul. And we'll see you Saturday.
Yeah, thank you both very much for having me, and
You're very
we'll have a
welcome.
good weekend.
Inside Outer Limits is a regular feature on the Paranormal UK radio network.